Welcome to Still Growing in Grace. I'm Mike Zanker. Join me and other amazing guests as we explore and discover better, hope-filled perspectives on biblical texts and difficult themes. Prepare to expand your understanding of God's love and amazing grace. Growing in Grace Ministries Canada and Hope Fellowship, as well as Eastside Church, invite you to enjoy today's program as we dig deeper into what it means to be still growing in grace. Hello and welcome. It's good to have you all with me this morning. It is Wednesday, 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and today we're dealing with part 7 in a series on hell, a better hope-filled perspective. Today's topic, we're going to dive into what the early church kind of perceived and what they believed on this topic, because I think it's important to look back that perhaps some of our concepts that we have heard about hell are more of a newer idea rather than what the ancient and early church believed. So let's dig right into this conversation. I think you'll enjoy it. If you are watching, comment and say hello. I'm watching live with you, and I hope I can get this video playing correctly. Here we go. All right, welcome back to Still Growing in Grace. We've been covering a pretty heavy topic on the tentacles of hell, all the belief systems that are connected to this thing we call hell, or what we've been told hell is, and only to discover it means more than we think and less than we think at the same time. So I've really enjoyed these conversations. Where are we going to go with today? Because I know, Richard, you said you had a spin on sheep and the goats. I don't know if you want to touch on that for a second, and because I know Bill talked about it, or I'd love to get in some of the history too of how the early church viewed this topic, because I think the Western church is totally ignorant, which means not knowing, of all that history.
Well, I think we can dive in anywhere with the thing. I think it's the one good thing is to recognize that the orthodoxy. I had somebody post the other day that the Orthodox believed in hell. The Orthodox, and that word just means conceptually the early teachings. The traditional teachings. But it all depends on which century you start that. You can start it in the first century, like in the immediate wake of Jesus being there with the early church through the first 500 years. And if we count that as orthodoxy, rather than us 2,000 years old daring to call ourselves orthodox, and part of the orthodoxy thing is that you don't evolve into the next step. It's said about David in the book of Acts that, he was faithful in his own generation, and we should be faithful in our generation. And sure, we pull some orthodoxy out of it, but we evolve it. We take the baton and we run. We're supposed to be running with it. But having said that, it is good to be able to recognize that the early church fathers and mothers over the first 500 years, that I think it's fair to say that the recent patristic scholarship on it shows that it was predominantly universalism. And just in the sense of all things being reconciled to God. Not that all things didn't need to be purged, not that all things didn't need to be reconciled. Yes to all that, but a belief in the steadfast love of God, that love will find a way, and love will come after us, and love will woo us, and love will win us. And I know that I thought Fred asked some good questions in our text stream today, messenger stream, that I thought were good too. But
Let's dive in.
Let me share just a couple of good resources here that if you're interested in this. Obviously, Ramelli's book, a female patristic scholar, Ilaria Ramelli, she's one of my heroes of the faith. I mean, she has a horrible issue with her health, but she sits there. She has to lay down when she's being interviewed, but it is so good. It is so blessed, and she's so pure and pristine. It's just a joy and an honor to listen to her. But she has written the opus on it. It's like 800 pages. It's called The Christian Doctrine of Apokatastasis, a critical assessment from the New Testament. Uh, so anyhow, it is comprehensive, but it's all throughout the New Testament that Paul obviously pointed to all sorts of universalistic passages. And each century, in the first century, it was Paul. In the second century, it was Clement of Alexandria. In the third century, it was Origen. In the fourth century, it was Gregory of Nyssa. In the fifth century, it was Theodore of Moscustia. I'm horrible at pronouncing some of these things, guys, but just Ramelli, if I could just read a quick quote, this is from her book. The main patristic supporters of the apokatastasis, and that is a word Peter used in Acts. That's not some mumbo jumbo word. Peter used that word to speak of the reconciliation of all things to God, of all, not some things, of all living things to God. But this is what the quote says. The main patristic supporters of the apokatastasis theory, such as Bardasian, Clement, Origen, Didymus, St. Anthony, St. Pamphilus, the martyr, Methodius, St. Macrina, St. Gregory of Nyssa, and probably the other two Cappadocians, St. Evagrius Ponticus, Theodore of Tarsus, Theodore of Mosputia again, St. John of Jerusalem, Rufinus, St. Jerome, and even St. Augustine initially, even though he later came against universalism later, that all these very numerous Christians, albeit not denying oh, I'm sorry, I'm misreading that. Cassian, St. Isaac of Nineveh, St. John of Delathea, Dionysius the Areopagite, and St. Maximus the Confessor, all of these others were grounded in the doctrine of apokatastasis, which is the belief that all things, again, are reconciled to God. There's no doubt that this was predominantly the early church's belief. And if you go back quickly, these are two key quotes. Basil, if you want proof, well, how do you know that the majority? How do you know it was the majority back then and not just a bunch of bozos? Just a handful of bozos that believe this. Listen to what Basil the Great said in 329. He said that the mass, M-A-S-S, the mass of men, Christians, say that there is to be an end of punishment to those who are punished. From his book De Ascetics. Saint Jerome, who was not a universalist and he was like Augustine, he was at some point, but then he backed off from it. He says, I know that most persons understand the story of Nineveh and its king as the ultimate forgiveness of the devil and all rational creatures. And so that's Jerome saying the mass of men in his day. And lastly, even Augustine, and this is in the fourth century, he said, quote, there are very many in our day. And the Latin for very many is, I won't even try. I've already butchered enough names already, but it can be translated majority, easily translated majority. So see, the majority in our day, who, though not denying the Holy Scriptures, do not believe in endless torments. All right. And just lastly, to close it, and then I'll shut up. David Bentley Hart, we all know him and love him. He notes that the early church fathers, who knew ancient Koine Greek far better than the modern scholars do, simply did not translate the word aionios kolossus as eternal punishment. Hart observes, and I'll close with this quote, patristic theologians as diverse as Origen and Gregory of Nazianzus, that's one of the other two Cappadocians we mentioned earlier, Gregory of Nyssa and Isaac of Nineveh saw in the phrase aionios kolossus, typically translated as eternal punishment, but possible to be read as correction for a long period or for an age or in the age to come. No cause to conclude that hell was anything but a temporary process of spiritual purification. So all that by way of saying, don't let someone intimidate your hope in this, your belief in this, even if it's just a fledgling hope and belief in this. Don't let them take it away from you and accept that orthodoxy, as defined by early church doctrine for the first 500 years of the church, did not uniformly support a hell, the concept of hell as eternal conscious torment. It's just not there. And, there were 6 theological schools. 4 of them were considered universalists. One was considered annihilationist, in that, just sinners are destroyed. And one, only the Latin church in Rome, that's the only one that really focused on endless torments. And they were, Rome was the center of power and empire and all that gunk going on. So anyway, I'll stop.
You don't have to. It's fun. This is great.
Yeah. No, I think exactly what you said, and there's a huge element of this. If you're watching this and you're like, wow, that was a fire hose of information, you're not wrong. It really is a
Fire hydrant.
Fire hydrant. Oh! Yeah. And UHF, that's another movie reference. I like my 80s and 90s movie reference. You're gonna drink from the fire hose. It is interesting because that is where so much of church history stems and really is in our minds or in our history of corporate faith rooted from Rome. And a lot of people I don't think realize that. I think Augustine really is kind of the linchpin of a lot of our indoctrination, imperialism, where the church is really connected to our national identity or our kind of identity as Westerners. And that happens in Rome, and it really spurs out of Augustine. And really that's where we see a massive shift happen. And this is the nutshell version for if you're listening. I did this for a pastor friend who's kind of on the same journey with us. And he's like, you just literally described the entirety of church history in like 30 seconds more succinctly than any professor I ever heard. And it really, it's true though. You have this.
He called you succinct?
I know.
Wow.
First 300 years, right? You had this kind of emerging churches, these pockets forming. And then we have Rome and Constantine kind of put a cross on a flag and win a battle and imperialize Christianity. And then it kind of stays consistent until about 1000 AD, just slightly thereafter. But it has a very different motive to it. It is the empire is using Christianity as kind of a carrot and a stick to control people. And that's evident throughout history, right? And the only way you do that is with a heaven that's rewarding and a hell that's looming in punishment. And that's, if you look at the precipitous of why the Roman church and scholar won, right, as opposed to the other schools of theology of the day, it's because the empire needed that message and not a message of pure grace, because that doesn't motivate people to be good citizens of an earthly kingdom, right? But even then, it has its bounds. And around 1,000 years later, Constantinople, Rome, these are the two strongholds. They get in a fight. One wants leavened bread, one wants unleavened bread, and a bunch of other stuff, and they split. And there's this great schism, right? And the Eastern Church breaks off. And it's funny because most of us are Western Church people. The Eastern Church is this kind of cousin that we don't even recognize when you really think about it. They're church, but they act so different and believe so different. We don't even really acknowledge them as children of the same faith paradigm. And yet they are. And in some ways, you have Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy have the longest roots back to that moment in time, but they still spur very farther. And then you fast forward another 5 years and you have the Protestant Reformation. And most people coming out of the Western Church, that's where we're getting our things from. And they just double down on a lot of those pre-indoctrinations that come from the Catholic tradition. But then they see a lot of stuff that's wrong with it and reform it, purge a bunch of it, but they don't get everything. And here we are 500 years later, and I do believe in our information age, with the church being fragmented as it is, 40,000, 50,000 denominations across the world, different translations of the scripture. We are entering a different transfiguration of the church, trying to parse through all this stuff. The reality is, for 2,000 years of illiteracy in the common person, only a very small people had the ability and luxury to interpret scripture. And even then it was from the Latin. And there were a lot of changes that were made. And so just to give context, that's not taught in our churches. That's not taught to lay people. That's not taught. We teach people about Bible stories. We don't necessarily teach them about our corporate history. And yet when you get into that and that fire hose, it's amazing how much you can realize that there's been a lot of stuff bolted on to our corporate theology that may not be as orthodox as Richard said, going all the way back to those first generation believers, which we actually have access to so many of the writings and the translations of, that even 50 years ago, you would have had to spend decades in a library with concordances and translation books and stuff to draw out just the tiniest nugget. And in the last 30 years, we have fast forwarded that information ability to us like that. And I can get online and see all these works, and you and me have access to this personally. And it's revolutionary. And yet it's interesting how rejected it is on a lot of the fear basis from these denominational paradigms.
I was horrified to find out that the early church fathers were not Martin Luther.
What?
I know. It's the fathers of the Reformation.
And he's only 500 years, and that's 1/4 of our history as a church.
Right. Yeah.
My respect for the Orthodox Church has greatly changed. And if I'm not mistaken, and you guys can help me out in this, I think the Eastern Orthodox Church does not have the same doctrine of hell that the Western churches do. Not in any way. I think they have much more hope-filled perspective in theirs.
As I understand it, that's somewhat accurate. I think it depends on, again, they're a lot more lenient with how they interpret it based on their local congregational level, for sure.
Well, and just a point of clarification before Fred there, it's just that orthodoxy does not mean, when I used orthodoxy earlier, I wasn't talking about the Eastern Orthodox. Correct. I was talking about just the concept of Christian orthodoxy. You hear people say, well, you're a heretic. A heretic is defined by somebody who rejects orthodoxy. Well, who's orthodoxy? And the true orthodoxy would be the first 5 centuries. So that's what I was addressing. The Eastern Orthodox, yeah, they are so different than the Catholic.
Yeah, and I think if I'm correct on this, in Eastern Orthodoxy is that you can hold any of these views, and you're part of the body because it's not considered dogma. So they welcome the different views and the conversation. Back a little bit, when you do a little study of history, there's one character after Constantine, and it's the Roman Emperor Justinian, who actually he's the one who put the council together, the Second Ecumenical Council, that ended up deeming Origen and his teachings, which obviously there's a lot of controversy about that, as a heretic. And a lot of that was due to his desire to, as Bill was saying, control the masses through the teaching of hell. And so that the church needed that. And so again, as a Bible college student, none of this
was taught.
Oh my goodness, none of this was taught.
And yet you go to college
to learn. We were being told one thing, but it wasn't that education. And I find it interesting because for us, Mike joked about it, but the church father was Calvin and Luther. That's as far back as that we went. And let me add one other thing for those who might be looking for another resource on this, which is also Ilara Ramelli and Robin Perry have come together to write A Larger Hope, volumes 1 and 2. And her version is the first, I forget how many years it is. And it's outstanding. And again, her scholarship is impeccable. It is just, I can't see how anybody could read that unless they want to say she's making all this stuff up, because it's just it's so much evidence.
Making up quotes, unless you're willing to say that.
You can look it up. Like Bill said, now you can back all this stuff up. So it's called A Larger Hope, and there's volumes 1 and 2.
And she did it with Robin Perry?
Yeah, Robin Perry does the second volume, and he picks it up in, I forget what century, and carries it forward.
Okay.
And there's a lot of great history beyond even the early church, even from the Middle Ages and after, even into the 18th century and 19th century, some great individuals who were preaching universalism. And even in the United States, there was a large group of churches that were Universalist churches.
Well, I think
Universalist Church of America.
Just for clarification, just again, not just for this group, because I think when we say the word universalism, we kind of have a collective understanding that this is inside the finished work of Christ.
Right.
Yeah.
Right? And there is a secular Unitarian universalism that has been labeled, and that label, just universal in and of itself, is usually used to point to that, where all faiths lead to God, or all faiths lead to the same understanding or whatever of God. And I think, at least I'm speaking for myself, I believe that God will go down every single walk of the human experience to draw every lost sheep back into himself, but that's Christ crucified at the end of the day. And so there is a pretty big difference in the universalism we're talking about, where the universal finished work of Jesus will restore and reconcile all things, versus all paths lead to the same interpretation and understanding of God. I just want to clarify that, because I think that can be one of the biggest retorts I get is, well, you just believe all people go to heaven. It doesn't matter what they do.
Right.
I mean, that, and so what that tells me, the inverse of, is I feel like some people need to go to hell, because we're talking about hell, because of what they do. If we just take the inverse of what they're trying to convey is, well, some people deserve to be in hell. And I think that's a whole loaded philosophy in and of itself. However, I don't believe all people go to heaven. I believe that heaven comes to us. And that's actually what the scriptures tell us, is that we're not being, by our own merit, going to heaven. Heaven is coming down and marrying its bride here on earth ultimately. That's the story of Christ. It's not some good people take the good escalator up and some take the bad escalator down. That's not the message of Jesus.
No, it's one of love. It's one of, I will die for you. We submit to the horror of the cross to take you down and take you in with us and change you completely. And so that means all of humanity. That word all really freaks me out, because who just said something about all things reconciled? I thought it was just all people. That's what most of us would have heard.
Richard.
Pardon?
Richard said it.
Right. So what does that mean? I'm asking this rhetorically, just for fun, because we got about 4 minutes to do a full theological talk on this.
Well, I think, Fred, at some point, maybe for the next one, maybe as a teaser for the next one, you ask about, what does this do to faith? What if there's some afterlife thing where everything is just automatically fixed? What does that mean, that the fire is separate from faith in Jesus? And I'd love to address that maybe in the next one.
That's a good one.
I would like to mention.
Go ahead, Randy.
Quickly, is that a guy that kind of flies under the radar from the last century, C.S. Lewis, who, he's written a lot, and so you can somewhat get confused over what he really believes. But he wrote a book called The Great Divorce, and when you read that book, it's hidden in story and allegory and fiction. So, but when you read that story, you realize what he's really trying to say, and it's really a universalist message. And he makes it was a very famous statement that he made, that the gates of hell are locked from the inside. And when you get down to what he means by that, that is a universalist message, that hell is not something being imposed on the human race. The human race has found themselves in their own hell, and they're locking the gates of a God who is trying to release them, even in the post-mortem experience. So I just thought, while we're talking about the patristic fathers, there's a guy right in our backyard who was alive within my lifetime, who's very well known and very well loved amongst the church, but very few people know this about him.
So, and then to address your question, Mike, I think all means all.
I know.
and I think it goes even more deep. And I know you can't answer this in 2 minutes, but it's part of what I've tried to convey with some of my writings is there's not an element of anything that we are involved with, that we experience, that isn't entangled in the finished work of the restoration of all things in this thing. It permeates from the cross, but the simplest, most meaningless moment of my life, tying my shoe, all the way to the moment of having to sit by my dad on his deathbed and contemplate life. Everything in between is included. And that goes for every single one of us, that there is not an interaction between two subatomic particles that aren't somehow entangled with this finished work of restoration. So that's kind of mind-bending for us, because we see things that we view as atrocities and terrors and stuff, but to realize, and the cross is the perfect example of that they can be reworked, they can be repositioned in a manner in which goodness can still be understood from them in the fullness of perspective. Maybe not in the moment, but in the fullness of perspective of time and healing and relationship. Wow. That's the message of Jesus. And if that's not good enough to believe in, and you have to have some sort of transactional element, I don't get it.
Well, the next conversation could be really fun. So we're going to wrap it up here. Fred, do you have the last second? Do you want to say anything there?
No,
okay.
I'm good. I'll wait.
Okay, we're going to get into the next one. I know what I want to start off with, but it's going to be really fun. So thank you for sharing in this conversation.
And in the next one, I'll have a couple of passages to talk about everything, not just human, but everything being saved.
Okay. Until next time. Thank you. All righty. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. Again, these conversations are exploring in a conversation way a dance through how theology has been perceived. Again, I hope it's encouraging. I want to unpack these concepts of hell and find better perspectives than, just like what Fred was saying, if you've been to Bible college or even Sunday school, you're taught one perspective, usually. Even though my professor taught me all of them, but I don't think there was an emphasis on any one of them. We skipped over it pretty quick. But he was true in that he didn't just give us one lens. I was very lucky in my one school, and I still know that professor today. He's a great guy. All right, we are going to finish up here. We have 3 more episodes. Today is episode 7. We still have 3 more on hell. I think the next one, if you can tell from the end of this conversation, it's going to be really good. In fact, let me cheat and just give you a heads up on what they're going to be. So we're going to be dealing with separation, illusion, antichrist, freedom from fear, and the afterlife, the next one. Then part 9, we're going to talk about the fear cliches that feed the lies regarding hell and why evangelize if there's no hell like we've been told. Anyway, and then part 10, blood on our hands and fear. Again, we're going to unpack how the tentacles of fear have been put onto us in a way that we didn't realize we were believing this concept of hell, of eternal conscious torment and separation, without really realizing it. And when you start to take one word out, suddenly all these other pieces start to fall, and it gets scary. It really does. But there's more, there's better, there's hope. So I hope you enjoyed that. And if you did, comment, let us know what you think. And we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Also, this will air tonight on the Grace Awakening Network live. So tune into that. You can see the links below, and we'll catch you next time. Join me next time on Still Growing in Grace. Enjoy previous episodes by downloading our podcast at growingingrace.ca. If this show's been an encouragement to you, consider making a donation today. For our Canadian link, visit growingingrace.ca, and for our USA link, visit eschurch.com. Your donation will help us continue spreading really good news. Thank you again for tuning in to Still Growing in Grace.